Welcome, friends. This is a special report. Breaking news, but the kind we keep trying not to hear. The United States, after a long century at the center, is meeting something it has not faced since the 19th century. A rival that is not a rumor, not a rogue, but a system big, coordinated, and increasingly confident. You can feel it in trade lanes, in energy flows, in the language of diplomats who suddenly speak like accountants. A transition point has arrived. We sensed it in supply chain shocks, in anxious markets, in households stretched by prices that never seem to fall back. Now it speaks plainly. The world is reorganizing, and Washington, led by a man who calls every retreat a victory parade, is pretending that a tariff here and a threat there can stop the tide. Let me tell you, denial is not a policy. It is a lullaby. What happened? In brief, the West aged into its comforts while the rest industrialized into its needs. China built ports, grids, and firms that climb from plastic trinkets to chip tools. Then it stitched links to Brazil, India, Russia, South Africa, and far beyond. The BRICS began as a headline, then it became a platform, then a magnet. Population, resources, industry, finance, not perfection, power. You see, the arithmetic of global capitalism shifted. While the U.S. spent trillions on wars it called operations, others spent hundreds of billions on factories they called development. While we deregulated banks, they overbuilt rail. While we celebrated unicorn apps, they multiplied steel, cement, batteries, and ships. It's not just innovation, it's humiliation for the old empires when a container fleet says more than a think tank. Now enter Donald Trump. He tells you the empire can be restored by punishing its customers and suppliers at once. A tariff for Mexico by morning, a reprieve by noon, a new levy at dusk for Europe or Korea, with Canada thrown in for theater. He calls this strategy, markets call it uncertainty, firms call it uninvestable, working people call it inflation. And that's the point. A president who sells deal-making as industrial policy is selling volatility as strength. It is a performance trick. Loudness for leadership, sanctions for statecraft. A camera-ready pose while capital hesitates. Let's be concrete. Tariffs raise costs. Retaliation shifts markets. The dollar rises or falls and moves pain around like a shell game. You can't predict the exact mix, but you can predict the result. Hesitation. Companies delay plants. Suppliers demand risk premiums. Logistics reprice. In capitalism, the 3% who invest decide the tempo. When they freeze, the 97% feel it as layoffs, smaller hours, and tighter budgets. Meanwhile, the president brags that higher prices prove his policy is working. Working for whom? The Ukraine war exposed another layer. Washington promised collapse in Moscow by cutting its energy customers. Europe obeyed and paid, but barrels and molecules do not salute. They flow. Russia sold to Asia. Tankers turned east. Discounts became deals. The supposed pariah found partners. Growth there outpaced forecasts here. This is not an endorsement of anyone's regime. It is a reminder that the world after America's unipolar moment is not a chalkboard. It is a market with alternatives. Deny that, and you end up predicting victories that never land. At home, the costs are shifted downward. Real wages stagnate, then slip. The federal minimum sits like an antique. 40 million people learn the price of eggs before they learn the language of bond yields. They know something is wrong. They are told to blame foreigners, refugees, or regulations. Why not ask about monopoly pricing, about buybacks, about the basic arithmetic of a system that socializes risk and privatizes gain? Instead, we get pageantry, a promise that we will be number one again, as if number one means much to the family negotiating rent on a Thursday night. The empire is fading not with a bang, but with a whisper in the grocery aisle. This is not just about China. It is about credibility. Allies who used to nod now ask for terms. They will still meet in Brussels, Tokyo, Ottawa. They will also meet in Riyadh, Delhi, and Johannesburg. They will compare offers, East versus West. Capitalism as finance versus capitalism as production. Efficiency versus monopoly. A sober country would prepare for bargaining in a multipolar world. A performative presidency calls every negotiation a test of masculinity. That is not strategy. That is branding. So here is the opening truth. We are not at the start of a comeback. We are at the recognition phase of decline. Recognition hurts, but it is the only adult route to repair. Stop calling every headwind a conspiracy. Stop calling every rival illegitimate. Start investing in people, in public goods, in boring infrastructure that returns for decades, not in press releases that fade by Friday. It's time we face it. The toddler hands over the eyes do not make the dog disappear. The world is bigger now, and it is moving. Let's pick up from there, friends, because denial doesn't just distort our politics, it drains our future. The United States built its dominance in the 20th century through scale, coordination, and a sense, however flawed, of shared direction. But what happens when that direction dissolves into chaos marketed as charisma? What happens when a leader sells rage as renewal? You get Donald Trump's economic theater, tariffs one week, tax cuts the next, and budget panic by morning. Every move is framed as a triumph against enemies real or imagined, while the structure of empire quietly erodes beneath it. You see, Trump's trade wars are not about rebuilding America. They are about preserving the illusion that America can bully its way back to 1,955. But the arithmetic is brutal. Tariffs raise prices. Inflation follows. Central banks respond by tightening credit. Investment slows. Wages freeze. Then the administration declares victory because a few factories reopen for the cameras, but behind those gates, the jobs pay less, the hours are shorter, and the debt is higher. That's not Renaissance. That's rearranging the furniture in a burning house. And yet, this denial isn't only his, it's institutional. Democrats and Republicans both live off the same donor class, the same 3% of employers who decide whether the economy breathes or chokes. Those at the top capture 80% of stocks and bonds. They make the calls on wages, prices, and policy. The rest of us, the 97% who work, rent, and borrow, are left to choose which version of neglect we prefer every 4 years. One promises trickle down, the other promises build back. Both end up bailing out Wall Street when the music stops. That's not a democracy in crisis. That's capitalism on autopilot running out of runway. Let me tell you something about this efficiency Trump loves to mock. In the 1,960 seconds, the federal civilian workforce stood at about 2.5 million Today, after half a century and 100 million more citizens, it's still 2.5 million. Economists call that efficiency. Trump calls it bloated. And his solution? Cut it further. Fewer inspectors, fewer regulators, fewer scientists, fewer public servants capable of saying no when corporate America demands another shortcut. This isn't efficiency, it's evisceration. It's what declining empires do when their rulers can't admit that the treasury is drained and the factories have moved. Look abroad. China quadrupled its average real wage over 3 decades. In that same span, America's barely budged. That single contrast explains why the Chinese government feels secure and why ours constantly needs an external villain. They built upward mobility. We built debt ceilings. Their workers gained, ours stagnated. And still, the rhetoric insists that America leads. Leads in what? Gun deaths? Incarceration? Military spending that can't win a war? Or maybe in the number of citizens working 2 jobs just to stay solvent while billionaires send rockets to the stratosphere for applause? Here's the paradox of the Trump doctrine. It claims nationalism while selling dependency. We threaten allies to buy more weapons, more gas, more corn, even as they quietly diversify away. When the U.S. can't compete on production, it competes on punishment. Sanctions become diplomacy. Tariffs become headlines, and the world, exhausted by the drama, learns to do business elsewhere. The BRICS expand. The dollar's dominance softens. The next trade summit is not in Washington, but in Beijing or New Delhi or Brasilia. The empire's capital is still noisy, but the world's center of gravity has shifted. This decline is not tragedy, it's trajectory. Every empire that mistook arrogance for permanence wrote the same script. The British, the French, the Spanish all discovered that global control is unsustainable when domestic inequality becomes unbearable. The United States is repeating the lesson in fast forward. Inflation is the new tax on the poor. Real wages are the old promise broken. Tariffs are the government's way of saying, you'll pay more now for the privilege of pretending we're winning. And still, Trump calls it taking back control. Control of what? The housing crisis, the healthcare debt, the climate chaos that his party calls a hoax while Florida floods. No, what he means is control of the narrative. He sells nostalgia as policy. He turns loss into theater. And millions, weary and angry, buy the ticket because at least it sounds like someone's fighting. But fighting the mirror doesn't change the reflection. Friends, the global economy is reorganizing while we debate slogans. Supply chains are rerouting, currencies are rebalancing, and alliances are reforming. The United States is not collapsing, it's recalibrating under duress. Yet under Trump, that recalibration becomes a tantrum. Instead of adapting to multipolar reality, he tries to blackmail it. Instead of building new partnerships, he threatens old ones. Instead of investing in production, he invests in propaganda. That is not leadership. That is legacy panic, the noise of an empire realizing it's been overtaken by the very forces it unleashed. We can either face that honestly or keep our hands over our eyes. The dog is still barking. The world is still moving. And the denial, well, that's the most dangerous export America still produces. Let's widen the lens now, because what we're witnessing is not just a political crisis or an economic dispute. It's a civilizational adjustment. For the first time since World War II, the world no longer orbits around Washington. It's multipolar, messy, and modern in ways American politics refuses to grasp. And Trump's movement, loud, nostalgic, and fueled by resentment, is both a symptom and an accelerant of that refusal. You see, empires rarely die with a gunshot. They die of narrative failure. They lose control over the story they tell about themselves. The United States used to narrate itself as the global stabilizer, the guarantor of peace through strength, the innovator of prosperity through competition. But that story has curdled. When Trump tells Americans that everyone else is cheating us, he's not describing trade, he's describing trauma. The trauma of realizing that the game we design now has new players who play it better: China, India, Brazil. They're not ideological opposites anymore. They're competitors using the same capitalist tools we once monopolized. The irony is painful. We taught globalization to the world. We sold it as efficiency, as freedom, as destiny. And now that same globalization has returned with a Chinese accent, a Russian energy grid, an Indian software sector, and a bill we can't pay. Trump's tariffs are his way of flipping the table because he can't win the game. It's economic vandalism dressed up as patriotism. And yet, beneath that vandalism lies fear not just of China, but of exposure. For decades, American prosperity depended on cheap labor abroad and cheap credit at home. We exported production, imported goods, and financed the gap with debt. That was our invisible empire. But now, when the rest of the world demands better terms, the illusion shatters. Trump's answer? Blame the world, then borrow more, punish the worker, then promise them vengeance. It's a carnival of contradictions. He says he'll rebuild the factory towns while gutting labor rights. He says he'll protect American jobs while his own firms outsource manufacturing. He says he'll fight the elites while governing for their portfolios. Let me tell you why this denial matters. Because while we waste energy on revenge fantasies, the rest of the world is building alternatives in finance, in logistics, in currency. BRICS nations now discuss settlements outside the dollar. That's not tomorrow's threat. It's today's trend. For every transaction that avoids the dollar, American leverage shrinks a little more. We once dictated terms through IMF loans and sanctions. Now other countries lend without lectures. They build ports without Pentagon escorts. The empire's favorite weapon, the dollar, is losing its monopoly not through rebellion, but through redundancy. And this is the real tragedy. The U.S. still has unmatched intellectual, scientific, and cultural power. But instead of leveraging that to cooperate, it's being weaponized to coerce. Trump brags about weaponizing trade. He calls it toughness. In reality, it's exhaustion. When a nation can't outcompete, it tries to out-threaten. But you can't scare a planet that has already diversified. You can only isolate yourself. That's what we're watching. The slow self-isolation of an empire confusing intimidation for strategy. Look at Europe. Once Washington's obedient partner, it's now quietly hedging its bets. Germany talks energy with China. France courts the BRICS. Even longtime allies like South Korea and Japan now coordinate their own responses, not in deference, but in defense. They have learned to plan around American unpredictability. That's what Trump's tariff circus has achieved. A world that prepares for America's next tantrum instead of relying on its next treaty. And at home, the costs compound. Infrastructure crumbles. Public schools lose teachers faster than they hire them. Healthcare devours paychecks. The social contract has been replaced by a subscription model of monthly payments just to survive. Meanwhile, the rich lecture the poor about personal responsibility while lobbying for new subsidies and loopholes. This is how a declining empire protects itself, by transferring the pain downward. Inflation wasn't an accident. It was the tool, a quiet way to lower living standards without admitting policy failure. And Trump rode that wave masterfully. He didn't create the anger, he harvested it. But his solutions are smoke. Tariffs don't rebuild wages. Tax cuts don't raise productivity. Blame doesn't balance budgets. And nationalism doesn't feed a globalized supply chain. What it does do brilliantly is distract. It divides working people by flag, color, or grievance so that the same 3% at the top can keep their dividends safe. You see, this isn't just Trump's ideology. It's capitalism's late stage reflex. When it can no longer expand outward, it turns inward and eats its own democracy. The ruling elite invent endless enemies: immigrants, China, the deep state, to mask their own parasitism. And while the crowd cheers, the empire rots. History has seen this before. The Romans called it bread and circuses. The British called it the white man's burden. We call it making America great again. Different slogans, same decline. So the question isn't whether America can recover, it's whether it can grow up. Can it accept a world of equals rather than subjects? Can it compete by cooperating instead of conquering? Or will it keep throwing tariffs like tantrums and sanctions like threats until the world moves on completely? Because make no mistake, the world will move on. We are standing at the edge of the post-American century, not in theory, but in practice. The lights are still bright, but the power is flickering. It's time we face it. The empire is not ending tomorrow, it's evolving today. And if we don't adapt with humility, it will continue without us. Share this, talk about it, and face the truth together. The next chapter of history is already being written, just not in Washington.